I am Tom Jackman, and I am the Rules Coordinator for the Energy Facility Siting Council. And we are here today to start the Rulemaking Advisory Committee for the Organizational Expertise and Retirement Financial Assurances RAC, and as I like to call it, IRFA. You know, call it what you will. It's a pretty long, long RAC name. This is the kickoff of what we have internally been calling phase 3 of our rulemaking process. When I started about 3 years ago, we one of the first things I did was begin a sort of rulemaking project to reorganize the rules in a way that would make them easier to understand, easier to follow, and which would lead into being able to then start to substantively tackle the rules once they've been a little more cleanly organized. And we've sort of been doing that a little bit. We have a compliance rulemaking that most of you met with last week. And we're going to continue tackling those substantive subjects, not just like process, how are the rules laid out. But the meat of that is going through each of the council standards, which I think is probably what developers are certainly interested in, and perhaps the public as well, because this is where the rubber meets the road. It's where, the developers spend a lot of time and effort to establish that they should be granted a site certificate. It's where the staff spends most of their time. So should be interesting, hopefully, and I'm curious to get all of your feedback and appreciate your willingness to donate your time and effort to participate in this process. So just quickly, I'm going to go through the RAC membership. I see most people are here today. There were just a couple people missing, but this will be recorded and posted on the website, and I'll send out a link to it after I get it uploaded, so people can peruse this at their will. And if you miss a future RAC meeting, you'll be able to watch the recording if you so desire. So let's see, just going to go from top to bottom here. If people are present, you can just introduce yourself and who you represent. Lena, go ahead and take us away.
Yes, hello, I'm Lena Cope, and I am a environmental specialist with Portland General Electric, and we hold several site certificates.
Okay, go ahead, David.
David Lawler, Executive Director for Development for NextEra Energy Resources in the Northwest. And I see some familiar faces, and we also hold a significant number of site certificates and have built relatively recently in Oregon.
All right, and Andrew?
Yeah, this is Andy Bauer with Northwest Natural.
Okay. You're a little quiet there, but I caught that. Okay. I don't see Diane here today. Let's see. For Nicole. Jordan. I spelled it wrong.
It's all good.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jordan. I'm with Tetra Tech. I do a lot of the land use planning stuff on the team, but also a variety of other things. And as many of you know, we assist with the preparation of a lot of EFSC applications.
All right. Dugan?
Hey everybody, Dugan Mayor with I work at Pine Gate Renewables, and we are a certificate holder. But I also, in this case, will be representing OSEA, the Oregon Solar and Storage Industries Association, representing several utility scale solar and storage developers in the state and their interests as it relates to these standards, and have recently, because of my position at Pine Gate, had a crash course in them. So I'm happy to kind of tell my personal experience, but also kind of express some of the industry's broader views on it. So appreciate the time.
All right, and then Troy. Yep.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine.
Hi, I'm Troy. I'm a member of the public. I've had a vested interest in solar sightings over the last several years.
Awesome. Really appreciate you being here, Troy, to represent the public. And then we have Sarah here. Can you introduce yourself?
Good morning. Sarah Esterson. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor, Oregon Department of Energy Siting Division.
And we are blessed to have two members of the Energy Facility Siting Council with us today, which is awesome. It's a record for me after last week where we had a record of one. So this is a good experience. Anne, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
So Ann Byer, I've been on the council for, I think, 3 years now, and looking forward to hearing people's comments.
Yep. We started almost exactly the same time, Anne.
Yeah.
And then Cindy, can you introduce yourself?
Good morning, Cindy Condon, EFSC member, for going on to my 6th year, and organizational expertise is a real interest of mine.
Yes. So, all right. I think that's everybody who is officially on there. All right. So we're going to kind of burn through these a little bit pretty quick since most of you are, I would say at this point, very familiar with the process. But we are again here. We've initiated the rulemaking and we are here to develop a draft of the proposed rules. So and I will say it's a little bit scary this time around because going into this process, we do a lot of internal development because we want to have a good sense of what the potential issues could be and where things will go, but to a varying degree. And this time around, we really, with the standards, I mean, there's some things that we want to work on, but I really am going to look to the RAC for guidance on where we want to take these standards. And, we looked at potentially, hiring experts on this subject, but it's kind of a tricky one. And so we may end up still needing and deciding that we need to get some sort of expert consultants as we get through the rulemaking process. But it's such a long process and expensive that in talking with the sort of internal staff, we sort of made the decision that we were just going to give it our best shot and, sort of decide as a RAC whether we feel like we can tackle this potentially, highly technical subject in terms of like what what optimal looks like. And then if ultimately we decide we need to sort of reach outside expertise in terms of people who are, deeply versed in organizational expertise and retirement financial assurance as subject matters, then we'll do so at that time. But I'm hopeful that we won't need to. But if we do get to that point, we will essentially table the RAC until we can retain those consults and then sort of reconvene. But fingers crossed that we won't have to do that. So just wanted to talk briefly about the statutory authority because I think that's always helpful for all these RACs. Like, what's driving, why do these rules exist in the first place? Because we aren't really allowed, no agency is allowed to just sort of create rules from nothing. It all has to be tied to statute. So the statute directs the council to adopt standards for the siting, construction, operation, and retirement of all facilities under their jurisdiction. And fascinating to me is that it says that the standards may address but need not be limited to the following subjects. So the word may is kind of interesting there, but we do have standards in the rules for all of the standards listed in the statute, including A and D here, which is the organizational, managerial, and technical expertise of the applicant to construction, operate the proposed facility, and the financial ability and qualifications of the applicant. So, and those are located in OER 345 Division 22, Rules 10 and 50. And you may be wondering why we're not having two RACs, why we're having just the one RAC to cover both of these. And it's sort of, from a practical standpoint, we looked at the number of standards and how long it would take to do that many RACs if we were to just do one RAC per standard. And it's pretty, it would take a hot minute, as they would say. But there is some overlap. So they're different in many respects, but there is some potential overlap, and I kind of wanted to go through that a little bit so we can kind of discuss, because there is going to be, I think, when we have discussions about the information requirements, there will be some overlap. The organizational expertise is more of a qualitative test. How do you prove that you're competent and that you're capable of building and constructing and operating a facility? There isn't, there are some, ISO standard type things that exist to try to, standardize that. And maybe this RAC figures out, maybe we can identify some existing standards that are not in the rules that would help, that we could potentially adopt as a pathway for establishing that organizational expertise in a more, discrete, known method instead of the current relatively vague standards. But we'll get to that here in a minute. But then the retirement financial assurance is more of a quantitative test. It's really, at the end of the day, it's kind of about numbers. There is a sort of qualitative assessment of what it would take to retire the facility, which is somewhat, there is some overlap there with the organizational expertise. So together they form the sort of institutional capability and credibility over the full life cycle of a facility. So I'm just going to run through a little bit about the sort of similarities and differences between these two. Again, and hopefully by the time I'm done, you'll agree that doing these in one rack wasn't a crazy idea. And we'll see how that goes. So first of all, there's sort of the ability to plan. From an organizational expertise standpoint, that relates to, whether the applicant can actually build, operate, and ultimately retire a facility, which is the kind of the heart of the standard itself. Whereas the retirement evaluates whether the applicant has planned for and can fund any end of life obligations. So the organizational expertise information requirements look at past experience with similar facilities, the corporate structure, and a demonstrated ability to manage complex projects. Whereas the retirement financial assurance looks at the sufficiency and reliability of proposed financial mechanisms, the likelihood those mechanisms will remain available when needed, and then also, I suppose I could add a bullet point there, the sufficiency of those plans to cover the proposed retirement plan. So these both deal with risk. Organizational expertise reduces risk that the facility is mismanaged, and then financial assurance ensures that even if the mismanagement occurs, funds are available to complete the retirement. So they're both sort of looking at the risk to the state. And they're both related in that a strong organization that proposes minimal or poorly justified assurances raises red flags, whereas a weak organization relying solely on financial instruments without operational competence also raises concerns. So there is some sort of, they reinforce each other. The more confident you are in the organization, the more confident you're going to be in the financial assurance, proposed financial assurance, and then vice versa. So the bottom line is, both of these standards ask whether the council can reasonably trust the applicant will responsibly manage the facility and its consequences for its entire life, including after it stops generating the revenue. So organizational expertise establishes who the applicant is and what they're capable of, and the retirement financial assurance ensures that even if those capabilities fail, the public is protected. And frankly, we don't have a lot of experience with and we have experience evaluating these, but we don't have a whole lot of experience with the fallout. Most of the facilities that are operated with EFSC granted site certificates are still in operation. So a lot of what we're going to ask about and think about is hypothetical, and we fortunately haven't had a whole lot of fallout from an organizational expertise standpoint either. So that is something that I want people to keep in mind as we sort of propose what ideal looks like in terms of how these standards operate. Is things have to be tied to not just the statute, but especially in the framework that we have right now with like the executive orders, there has to be a reasonable basis for what it is we're asking from the applicants. which is sort of tricky to do because things have operated, I would say, relatively smoothly. Any?
I just had, it's true, but we hold a site certificate for probably the oldest wind facility, and yeah, it's currently it's not too far in the distance. So we're already planning, so we'll bring some of that. And we have had to decommission other projects in other regions as well. So just it's one of the reasons why we volunteered for this rack in particular.
Well, we will definitely be looking to your experience to help and give us shed some light on potential issues that we're not even, potentially anticipating in terms of the complexities behind these. Because these are relatively complex standards, but it can be hard to determine, the staff that has to evaluate these, they're not necessarily experts in these subject matters. And so and we do get, we do have outside consultation, and we talk to other agencies and stuff, but, we rely a lot on the applicants when they make representations. But I feel like if we can maybe optimize these, and that's what the next two slides are going to be, but think about how we can improve the standards so that applicants have a better sense of what they need to submit to prove that they've met the standards, and that the staff and the public and the other agencies who are evaluating what was submitted have a better sense of the sufficiency of what was submitted. I think there are some gaps there across all our standards, and that's just something we've learned through time, through applying them and through evaluating them, where we've identified some of these gaps. So that's the whole point of periodically doing these rulemakings, is to say, hey, we've got some experience. Let's see how we can make this stuff better. So let's talk about organizational expertise first. And I have a sort of a slide afterwards for RAC discussion, but because we have sort of two separate subjects, feel free to chime in right here as we go through this. This is not exhaustive at all. This is just me and the team sort of thinking about these potential things we can look at. If there are other things that are sort of under this umbrella or more or outside this umbrella, but still deal with the standard, yeah, this is the time to raise this. So first of all, can we better my thinking is we can better define the standard. Right now, the standard says that the applicant has to, meet this, establish that, but it doesn't really, in my mind, and maybe we can't improve it, but I feel like it's worth perhaps attempting to improve the definition of what it means to do those things, which would then sort of clarify how you would be able to prove that you met them. I don't know if does that make sense to everybody? Because right now it's sort of, I don't want to say vague's not the right word, but undefined, perhaps, in terms of what this standard actually is. And in line with that, my hope is that we can better align what the standard is, however we define it, with the information requirements, so that there is as good of an overlap as we possibly can. In other words, if we ask for something, it's because we're going to use it to evaluate it, and we don't have legacy or sort of standards that or information requirements that somebody thought was a good idea, but we find we never use them. So why are we making people spend the time and money to submit that stuff? But also, we want to eliminate any gaps where we find ourselves constantly having to ask them for information because it's not technically in the standard or in the rule, but we find ourselves needing that information to adequately evaluate whether the standard has been met. So, yeah, that's going to be one of the main goals for all of these standard review rulemakings. And as part of that, clarifying like what types of information and data can be submitted to help establish meet the standard. Right now, it's sort of a lot of this is left open to the applicant. I do think if we could, to the best of the RAC's ability, identify the specific types of information that we feel would be adequate in meeting in establishing that the standard is met, then it would be easier for the applicant to determine what they needed to do, but then also staff could get more comfortable or familiar with reviewing the same types of information. It would accelerate our review process. And And then down here, some more specific items specific to this standard. I'm hoping we can improve clarity on how joint ventures, partnerships, and LLCs are evaluated. There is some stuff in this standard right now that basically asks for the information, but it doesn't really, there's no, we're asking for it, but there's no basis for the evaluation. Like we get it, but then staff doesn't really know what to do with it. Like it's not clear what it means for those things to exist. And how like an LLC, for example, which is how a lot of these are submitted, are there things that we should be looking at or concerned about versus just a traditional corporate structure. And then potentially looking at improved guidance on how future organizational changes will impact things, include, whether we think it even makes sense to monitor it, whether we should ask for it at all. I mean, right now the rules say you have to submit like your org chart and all these other things, but it's not clear what the department should even do with that information. So if wherever it's not clear what to do with the information, I want the RAC to ask ourselves, should we be asking for it? So, and if we are, and if we decide that it does matter, then should it matter if it changes in the future? Because there are conditions of approval, and those conditions, certain of them, if they change, then that triggers certain other changes. So is this one of those things? If we care about your org chart and your org chart changes, should that matter? So that's a question I want, and I don't know the answer to those questions. So it's something that I'm hoping that we can look at. Is there any other preliminary sort of issues or topic areas that people can think of, if you've thought of this standard at all, that you can come up with right now? Yeah, Dugan, go ahead.
I guess, in between the lines here, I think my perspective, as his perspective, is this has always been an awkward, somewhat the retirement has always been an awkward standard because it's asking the agency and EFSC, who are not energy developers always by trade, to evaluate the business of an applicant and say, like, do I like the way that you set up the LLC structure and how that falls back on the parent company? Do I like the way that you have designed projects in the past? As developers, and I'll speak from the renewable energy world, we're used to being asked, say in an RFP about, oh, have you built something like this before? Please prove that to us. But I think, and then also knowing, the nature of the industry projects get sold and bought, we do have the transfer standard here. So that does take care of some of that risk. But asking someone, are you going to be able to, if there are several people whose businesses are development only until operation, and they're going to sell the project when it begins operating, but we're asking them during the permit process if they can operate a facility for 40 years, and maybe they can't, but that isn't very material to meeting the requirements. So I think, what we're more generally looking for is standards that align a little bit better with how things are done in the real world today by energy development entities. And I know that's kind of hard to capture in maybe one single standard, especially when I'm thinking of it specifically within wind and solar, but the standard has to cover all facilities. And then I guess one push from us is, especially with these standards, pushing a lot of this into requirements in the site certificate. Getting a bank letter, and we can go to the next one, but getting a bank to sign a letter saying that they might want to give me a bond. It's an incredibly non-committal letter from a financial institution. It doesn't, in my mind, doesn't really mean anything. The thing that means something is you can't start construction until you have a bond. That's a very clear standard to me. And so the more ways that we can get towards standards that are built into site certificates, or this standard can kind of push into requirements within the site certificate that has a compliance mechanism. And I do really appreciate all the work EFSC and DOE, ODO are putting into compliance efforts. I think the better, because otherwise we're just vaguely guessing something that, doesn't really, construction might not start for another several years. After construction is over, operation is maybe 5-7 years away from when we made this initial judgment, both on organizational expertise and financial readiness. And so I think that just puts the standard at a bit of a disadvantage. And I'm wondering how to align it more with what we see on the ground. So I guess that's kind of the thing I'm reading in between the lines of all this. I think these are all important, though.
Yeah, I think that raises a really good question that has also come up recently in internal discussions, which is, do we need to have information requirements in the standards that you sort of prove out, or can it just be a mandatory condition? So you don't necessarily have to establish it per se, such as that it's a condition that you must meet prior to building or as part of operation. So it's not something that we evaluate prior to you getting the certificate. It's just something you have to do or you can't build and operate. And so there is going to be future rulemakings on what the mandatory condition should be. And I'm hoping that part of what these rulemakings here with the standards is that maybe we identify some things that we say this, I mean, they can be in both. It can be in the standard and also be a mandatory condition, but it could potentially make lives easier if we decide, well, we don't feel like this needs to be in the standard. It can just be a mandatory condition. That could be something that simplifies things, potentially, maybe not. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, and I see Cindy there, and it's also when an LLC changes, and I know this is kind of, but there was same parent, same structure, but a new LLC, and there was a lot of more effort than I thought would have been needed to just if the same org structure happened. And so I don't know if that comes, that it is kind of part of organizational expertise, but it's different when it's just the change in ownership, but the other structure stays the same. I don't know if you can put it down in this, but I would like to discuss that as part of the organizational expertise, because again, that's often an amendment, but this is all part of the same standard.
Correct. If you get an amendment, you have to establish that the project as amended still meets all the standards. So, yeah.
Yeah. So just that will be something I'll bring up, because again, if nothing else changes other than a change in LLC, depending on discussion in the RAC on simply LLC.
Yeah, I think
there should be lesser requirements than if it is an amendment that actually changes other dynamics other than just the LLC. But anyway, I can get into explaining that more as we go along. But that is something that I'd like to bring up, as I don't know if it fits clearly within this, but it is something that I'd like to bring up as part of the rulemaking.
Absolutely. I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I will say that the sort of confusion around how much we care about LLCs and how it impacts how we evaluate a project, given this standard, is what is I believe is driving us to do this. Has driven us to do the standard first. So I don't know, Councilmember Condon, I don't know if you want to take this moment to sort of oh, go ahead.
For clarity, it was just, we were doing that, and I know that lots of discussion happened, and it took a while, and we got there, but I don't know if you remember that, Commissioner Condon.
I remember a lot over that has happened since my time on EFSC, and so yes, I do, and I'm a little bit confused, or not confused, but uncertain of my role here as an EFSC member and part of the council, because obvious, or part of the RAC, because this discussion is really important, but how much I should weigh in is a question to me. So, but
weigh in as much as you want. I mean, ultimately, you have to approve everything that we do. So it doesn't really, there's no conflict of interest. We're here at your behest to do the rulemaking that ultimately you will approve. So you can't really muddy the waters any more than you already have.
Good. Okay, good. Well, just on that note, I mean, I don't think there's anybody on the council, including me, that wants to take more time evaluating things that don't make sense or that cause issues that don't have real impact. And so from my perspective, and I would guess that at least some of you have heard comments I have made. I think the organizational expertise standards and review are just inadequate, and your involvement in LLCs as a structure are done for a business reason, and I get that. I was in business for many years, and I get that. But from my side of things, it's like, what is the purpose and what does it change? And if the evaluation was done on a particular entity, a named LLC that says we're going to do this, and then there's a change, I do think there should be sufficient review. What sufficient review means is a question to me. But that's part of why we're having this discussion. So I don't know if that makes it any clearer, but that's how I am thinking about this whole discussion.
Yeah. So to make sure that I capture what you're saying, because I do think I've also been a little confused exactly where we want to go with this. We want the RAC to answer the question, what does it mean for an LLC to submit versus not an LLC, and how does that impact how we evaluate the proposed project? And then ultimately, if there are changes down the line, does that trigger anything? Because if it mattered, then I don't know, it feels like it should continually matter, right?
I mean, that is what I think. There's a lot of time and expense and whatnot going into it in the first place, and it is a given entity, and that for me does matter. So now there's a change. I don't know how much review it would take, but hopefully this discussion will cement what me as an EFSC council member, but EFSC council together would need to be confident that, yeah, this nothing's or is changed. The evaluation is good, was good for the first one and is good for the second. So just on that particular issue, but I would say it doesn't matter whether it's an LLC, it's any site certificate holder or applicant. So that's what I want to see.
Patrick, can you introduce yourself and then go ahead and share your comment?
Yep, sorry for joining late. Patrick Rowe, Department of Justice, attorney for EFSC and the Department of Energy. And I am joining late, but I think the scope of this rulemaking is Division 22 organizational expertise and the retirement and financial assurance standard. And this scope of this rulemaking does not go into Division 27 site certificate amendments. Is that right?
Well, I mean, to the extent that this standard has to be met by the original application and an amendment, I would say there is some overlap. But you're correct that this doesn't directly address how an amendment evaluation occurs. But yeah, ultimately, any project as amended has to meet the standard. So if we want I don't know. I guess the how those two things play out maybe is something that we need to evaluate.
I think I mean, I understand the comments that are, that David Lawler brought up and that Councilmember Condon just made about if a site certificate is issued under the name of one LLC, but then that site certificate holder comes and says, all right, we're changing names or we're selling it to someone else, then that would be analyzed initially under the Division 27 amendment rules. And so it may be that you want to expand the scope of this rulemaking potentially to include the amendment rules.
Yeah, there's nothing stopping us from doing that other than the council telling us we can't do that. But
Yeah.
assuming they're okay with us, we can have the scope of this rulemaking be as crazy broad as we feel like we need to. There's no artificial limitation beyond that.
Mhm.
Councilmember Byer.
Thank you. I think Patrick kind of nailed it. When we've run into these issues on the council, it has been in the amendment process when we are changing ownership or LLC or tax structure. And I think as a council member, what's been not frustrating, but concerning to me is we're seeing all sorts of changes in organizational structure that our administrative rules weren't really designed to handle. And again, this comes up most in the amendment situation, so we want to be aware of that. But I think getting back to one of Tom's early points, really, as a council, we're kind of measuring risk. We're measuring risk to the public of these projects not being constructed at all, not being constructed as intended, and ultimately not being decommissioned as we were thinking they would be. So we kind of come at this from a risk assessment perspective, knowing that we don't want this process to be so burdensome or trying to anticipate things in the future that we have no clue about. But that's just kind of an overview of what we're looking at. And you're right, we don't come at this with the developer's perspective, but understanding that there are organizational tech situations that assist developers. How do we make sure our standards and our requirements to protect public health and safety align with those? So thanks.
All right, thank you. Dugan?
I'll keep this brief, but no, I really appreciate that discussion. I think one thing on the LLCs, maybe not amendment based, is I know Councilmember Condon in things I've seen you ask about kind of how do these project LLC, common practice in the development industry right now is to have a project LLC. This is what we have for our site certificate under an organization that's a larger LLC that actually employs the people that would be working on the project LLC and developing the project itself. And I do wonder if we can codify some kind of permissible like structure there where it's like maybe if you've chained like 50 LLCs under each other, maybe that's scary to us from a risk perspective. But if it's pretty clearly there's a project LLC underneath a development company LLC, like we can say, not that 100% that you've met the standard, but maybe that you're in something that we would consider a relatively like appropriate and not like too legally dubious of a standard. I mean, I think the reason we're all in these little limited liability things is due to liability. That's why, companies like ours pursue something like that structure. And so I do wonder if there's a way to kind of thread that needle or at least create something where it would make the council more comfortable about a relatively common setup for a project LLC under a development company LLC. I do think, maybe I spent too much time in the state of Missouri, but the state of Missouri is the show me state. And I think that is kind of where I approach these standards. We can say a lot of things in the application, but I keep back to why not put some of this in the site certificate itself. Say one example that's coming to my mind is say you're a development company that does not plan to operate the facility. Maybe one requirement in your site certificate is that you show that you have signed a contract with an operations company before you start construction, or at some point during construction. And so you don't need to have the organizational expertise to, maybe you've never operated a facility in your entire company's life, but your standard practice is to use third-party operations companies. I want the standard to be able to capture things like that, where instead of maybe proving it again years before it's necessary, having something in your site certificate that is more to, do you have the thing that we want to eliminate the risk of this project doing something we don't want it to do? And I continually get a little bit uncomfortable with the state coming in and saying, it's our interest whether this project gets built in the first place or not. I mean, I think that is ultimately a business and like economic decision. I think where we more should focus is, are they going to be able to meet the things that they said they were going to do? And if they don't, can we decommission the site? Okay. I think that is where I see the public interest here. But again, that's from a little bit of a development perspective.
So before I turn to you, Councilmember Condon, I will throw out that I agree with everything you just said in terms of, to the extent we are comfortable with sort of other structures, it should be captured in the rules. So A, people know that it's okay, but B, if there are sort of any idiosyncrasies in terms of like, oh, it's okay, but you got to do A, B, and C, that's also captured, as you said, potentially, in terms of like, again, like a mandatory condition or an obligation of some sort. But with respect to your second point, I will say that the state, especially with like recent direction from the governor with executive orders, there is a vested interest that projects do get built. I mean, there's huge demand for energy, and obviously, if there's sort of money to be made, then somebody's going to build it. I that's kind of my perspective. But on the other hand, like there is a limited capacity with the interconnect queue, which is a huge backlog. So like we don't necessarily want to approve projects that are going to then end up on the interconnect queue that then ultimately never get built because of mismanagement or whatever. So, whether or not a corporation or an entity is competent and is capable to ultimately build something, I do think the state has an interest in that, even though it's not necessarily to avoid like, catastrophic, health and public safety risk. There is a sort of energy shortfall down the road that's sort of predicted that I think the state is trying to get in front of. Councilmember Condon, you're muted, tragically. Hold on. No, I can't unmute you.
Sorry,
There you go.
There we go. Got it.
Yep.
Sorry, I appreciate that comment, and that was certainly came to mind as well. That we're operating under some different guidance now that does look at, is it going to be built? I mean, from a council perspective, but just an overriding thing for me in the structure, the LLCs under a parent company, is the opaqueness of it to us. So, I appreciate your comments, Dugan, about, what else, what do you need to clarify that? And up until now, I have really not heard any even question like that. What would make you comfortable? And when I go to evaluate, and I would guess other council members, and look at this and look at the LLC and look up, and it's an LLC of an LLC subsidiary of, multiple LLCs and a parent company that says we're not responsible for the debts of the company, of the LLC, that is risk to the state. And I view it as public health and safety. It might be financial safety, whatever, and it might be too broad a definition that I have, but I appreciate the comment and the question, what else do you need that would make council comfortable? And that is why this is important to me, this rec.
So one other thing that comes to mind is sort of outside of Oregon expertise. I've, done some research on my own to try to identify how other states handle this. But I know that you all have more experience you have actual experience, or at least some of you, in operating outside of the state of Oregon. So to the extent that like you deal with organizational expertise or needing to prove out similar types of stuff to get construction rights in other states, it would also be helpful to get that perspective as well in terms of what other states are comfortable with. That's not to say that we wouldn't necessarily want to have a higher or lower standard than another state, but to get that perspective would be, I think, helpful as well. David, go ahead.
Yeah, and we'll get more into it. I think the whole structuring around it, whether we do what Tom said too about having it as part of the amendment process is important. But one thing to always remember is, yes, the parent company isn't liable, but your lenders are. This is very, very important for everybody to understand. When you're building, let's call it for a round number, $1 billion asset, your lenders have step-in rights. They are not going to let this fall. And it gets to be a much more of a on the back end. So anyway, just like there's reasons why it's all structured the way it is structured, and it's not solely the it's all of our responsibility to make sure it all happens, but it's set up in a very specific way to make sure that the people that are lending you the money to build the project have a nice clean right of how they will be able to step in and take responsibility. I don't want to get into too much, but that's one of the reasons. And so I think it's very important that we have this so that we know that it's what is acceptable and what would need more explanation. And that's the same with having the parent company with organizational expertise, whether it be, I think Dugan said it was more on, for his company, it was more on, getting the entity that has the organizational expertise. In our case, it's, it would be an affiliate of our, parent company that would have all the expertise. So anyway, we're not going to solve it on this first day, but it is one that I'm willing and wanting to jump into. Like it's important to get this ironed out a little bit.
No, that's a good point. I mean, and this is another reason why, like I said, I went to law school, but I wasn't a corporate lawyer, so I didn't have to think about these things either. In terms of like, it's not just the state that would be holding the bag. It would, it's the lenders who care, right? They're the one that wants the return on investment. So if, they were to loan money to get a project started, for, example, there's some due diligence that occurs there, but I mean, at the end of the day, the state does have an obligation to ensure that regardless of what the structure is or who cares, that the state is adequately assured that things will develop in a way that's, reasonably assured, of success or whatever, that various things are protected. We can't just rely on the interests of lenders or other interested parties. But that is a good reminder that it's not just, the LLC versus, the state. All right. Well, I mean, I think we definitely have a good sense that we're going to have to talk about organizational structure, not just expertise, as we sort of plan out future agendas for future racks. So I'll be thinking about how to structure that, and maybe even maybe I'll even I haven't done this before, but maybe I'll even share like a draft agenda and see if people have any thoughts about how that should look. This is definitely more outside my comfort zone in terms of how we're going to proceed than other rulemakings that we've done. So let's turn to the retirement financial assurances subject. So the first half of the slide is kind of exactly the same questions. Can we better define the standard? Can we better align the standard with the information requirements? Can we clarify what types of information can be and should be submitted to meet the standard, as in terms of this is acceptable, this isn't acceptable. It's always a balance, all rulemaking, all legislation, between, having things be really prescriptive. The certainty is great, but then there's no flexibility, when you have different types of things come up where you're like, well, that information requirement makes sense most of the time, but not in our particular case. And so if the rule had been a little more flexible, then it could have accounted for our situation. But then if it's too flexible, then it's very confusing about what, so it's just a perpetual battle of trying to get that balanced out just right. But I think, we've had some years now of these existing rules. Can we tweak that balance a little bit? I think that's going to be the question. And then in terms of the more specific stuff to this particular standard, I want us to think about, acceptable methodologies, assumptions, contingencies for estimating retirement costs, I think would be kind of critical here. If we sort of can standardize that, I think that would go a long way towards clarifying this standard. Currently don't account for inflation and cost escalation. Should we? Is that a concern? And then again, related to, this is sort of where the overlap is, should change in ownership and insolvency they're not really addressed at all in the standard. Should they be? Should we clarify what would trigger a required update of a financial assurance amount, sort of related to previous bullet points? Should we consider specific guidance on retirement requirements based on the type of the facility, or can a more generic one-size-fits-all approach work? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. If there are like significant differences between retirement of wind versus solar versus, pipeline, I guess, or whatever else could potentially get built in Oregon, does it make sense to have different requirements? And then, should we clarify how significant design changes impact plan and cost updates? Or should that just be something that's sort of taken care of through mandatory conditions that are specific to a given facility? So that's me and some internal folks, mainly Sarah, sort of spitballing, what we should be addressing with this. We're taking a look at this standard, but I don't know if there are any additional thoughts or ideas that people have, or if it's maybe captured by our previous discussion. That would be, that's totally fine too. But I think this one maybe will be easier than the other one to prove out. Certainly has been, I think, overall less confusing, but yeah.
Just a clarification. Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine. But go ahead, Jordan. Go ahead, and then we can.
Oh yeah, I was just going to add. I checked with a few other folks on our team, and a couple things that have come up related to this. Again, I don't know if this is exactly the right time, so stop me if this is in too much detail. But something that has come up was like people seeking clarification on Odo's percentage markup added to manage the decommissioning process. There was a suggestion to base it more specifically on an estimate of who at Odo would actually need to be involved and how much time it would take them, as opposed to the current flat percentage. And the other thing was an interest in receiving credit for scrap value of materials.
Yeah, I mean, those are things that, yeah, I mean, certainly if things come to you, regardless of how specific or in the weeds they are, definitely, I'm going to bring that up at the end here, but send me an email, of like, oh, it would be great if we could address this. Those are exactly the types of questions I want us thinking about in terms of this has been a concern and it's related to this standard, and hopefully we can address it now. Yeah, with respect to the markup, you're talking about just the standard Odo. You're estimating it's going to cost X, and we're going to take that number and bump it up by X%.
Yeah.
Okay. And you're hoping we can tweak that by.
So my understanding is, sorry to interrupt you, but
Yeah, go ahead.
it's currently based on like a flat 21% markup, but it's not actually tied to an estimate of who will be doing the job at Odo, like job title, salary rate, and how much time it would take them. So just more clarity there. We're tying it to something more specific.
I see. Okay, that's definitely something we can look at.
Okay.
David?
Yeah, mine's more just a question. I don't know if it's in here, I guess, clarify triggers, but it's also financial institutions. Like, I think you guys review that periodically anyways. Is that my understanding? So it probably doesn't need to be in there, but I know you have a list of financial
There's some things we
institutions
do
for the
now
bonding and stuff.
that
Yeah.
we potentially would want to formalize, like that are sort of policy, I guess, that we're like, well, we do it, but it's not in the rules, and maybe gets confusing, and maybe it should be in the rules that we do it, and that periodic review of financial institutions could be one of those things.
Okay, because I wasn't sure exactly how, and I thought it was also the same. It says it's not in the rules about escalation. That's true, but then when you get your periodically as things depreciate too, you have to resubmit your cost estimates and potentially change your bond too after you build. So I don't know if that's policy or if that's in the rules. It's probably it fits in with what you're saying here. If we want to move things from sort of general practice to at least a standard in the rule. So I was just asking those questions. If as we try to unpack this, we might have to be looking at both of those things. And those were the two that I came up with, because I know that we do resubmit bonds based upon changes in what we've built or if other things. So I don't know if that is as institutionalized as it should be.
Yeah, that could be a mandatory condition, but yeah, like if you only build half the facility, then your bond doesn't need to be as large as it initially, was agreed to, for example, right? Yeah, so if to the extent that that's not clear in the rules, maybe, we should consider making it that way. Or I don't know, if people are comfortable with the way things are now, then that's fine too. But answering those questions and thinking about them, I think is definitely within the scope of this rec.
Yeah, that's what I'm meaning. We're actually fairly comfortable with it the way it is, because when it comes to your first report, you then say this is what we built, and then you change your bond. So anyway, but it should be discussed. That's all I'm saying.
Yep, agreed. Dugan?
Yeah, I also appreciate, I think, the way that it's been approached so far, like doing a lot of stuff either in pre-construction or within compliance. I think, Odo has been flexible there, and I think that is really helpful for developers who are just trying to right size this financial assurance to whatever they've ended up building, and that, a lot of things, interconnection, who wants to pay for the power, all that stuff goes into what finally gets built. And I think the state should understand that often people are permitting to the greatest extent they could imagine the project being. I don't go in thinking I'm going to have 5 amendments to expand my project. So I think a lot of, I guess other people can approach it different ways, but I think that's true. I think one thing I would like to see codified in this standard, and I don't think we've had an issue with it, but it's something, when Tom, you mentioned other states, the biggest thing we've seen policy wise around the country around retirement bonding is just the ability to quantify. And I don't know if we need a certain kind of threshold, but the kind of the salvage value is what we call it. And there's several bills around the country we can look at around this, but the salvage value of a site when you retire it and how much that should offset the cost of that bond, right? How much money you think, let's say in a solar site, like the steel is very reusable, recyclable, has a value to it. In the racking system, for example, the panels are a little bit more complicated because large scale panel recycling isn't really a reality right now, but that's mostly because a lot of panels haven't needed to be recycled yet. So anyway, there is this idea of salvage value, and I want to see if that can possibly be at least in kind of a maybe not a required condition, but a part of this, say like that is something that can be factored into that bonding calculation. And then I see this note about changing ownership and insolvency, and I just want to make sure we're being careful about, when retirement is triggered. I'm sure if there's, an issue where someone's like, oh, I'm not out of business, but then everything, their thing says they're out of business. Like, when do we exactly retire? I think, my recent experience of going through a Chapter 11 process, we are not going out of business. The asset LLC is like okay and is likely to transfer ownership soon. So I just want to make sure that in a unique number of situations, we're not triggering retirement of the facility by the state if all other options or all other understandings of insolvency are not thought of first, I guess is what I'd say. I don't think that's being proposed, but I just want to bring that up given our recent experience, and I know the council's recent experience with Pine Gate specific issues. But
yeah, that makes sense. Council member Condon, you're muted.
Thank you. I don't want you to hear me cough.
Yeah.
This is not the time to talk about it, but I do want to just respond. When people talk about the salvage value and how that should be calculated, is that a suggestion that anyone could possibly estimate the salvage value at the end, of like 30 years, or that is really a murky water for me. And so when salvage value comes up, it's like, would we really try and estimate that at some time at the time of a site certificate or interim 30 years before it is over? So I'm kind of interested in how that thought process works, and we'll probably talk about that more later. But heard it twice in this discussion, and so I'd love to know more about.
I think it's helpful to know that the council did look at this question 7 to 9 years ago. I could go back and look that up, and it was ultimately decided that it was too uncertain. But I mean, thinking about this for all of 5 seconds, maybe my mind would be changed by reviewing the previous sort of analysis that was done, is that, maybe we could look at like scrap value going back some number of decades, and things go up and down. The nickel goes way up and goes way down, like, as things like suddenly it's really important for batteries and the price goes up, and then I don't know, sudden new chemistry comes out and the value of nickel goes way down. I don't know. But there, maybe we could propose like a I don't want to say it's like not a fair market value, but like a sort of a worst case scenario. Over going back a certain number of decades, it's never been below this value. So like peg that to inflation, and then, basically giving you some credit for the scrap value, not trying to like estimate what it would actually get you. I think it's a fair question for us to look at again. But with the understanding that we can't come to the same conclusion that we did before.
And just to follow up on that, I think the council examined it more recently than that and decided the same thing, too uncertain. But I also have in my mind that when this comes to be, it's at, something has happened and the bond is for the state's protection. And if there's credit given for salvage value in the amount of the bond, it is the state that comes in, and who's selling that? Who's getting the salvage value? And that's part of, how does it all play out? Because this is a bond in favor of the state to do the job, which would include that. And I know some of you know more about, have modeled that out, but that's pretty opaque to me as well. So more conversation to follow. Sure.
Troy, go ahead.
Yeah, so sure. So being a member of the public and not being involved in some of these activities that have obviously been going on and discussions that have been had, I'm feeling a little behind the pitch here. So if I understand correctly, we're talking about the possibly of salvage being given back to the state here. I don't quite understand. As part of the remediation, that makes no sense to me whatsoever. I don't know why the state would want to be involved in that. So maybe we can have. I just don't think we're ready to get into that discussion into the weeds yet, are we? Or do we want?
No, I mean, this is more of just highlighting potential things to look at down the road, so I can, schedule agendas for racks and people can have an idea. So this is more of like an issue spotting. I don't think we're going to solve that question here by any stretch. But, this standard basically says that you have to assure the state, and we basically do that through a bond, that in the event that things totally fall apart and you go bankrupt and you don't have a penny to your name, that there is a guarantee somewhere via something like a bond that will essentially cover the costs to restore the land to whatever the terminology is in the rule, but back to the way it was before, so that it's in a usable state. And I think the point that was raised by some of the industry folks is that even if they were to sort of disappear and get transported to the Starship Enterprise, and there was all that was left was the stuff on the land, and not a single person it was around to lay claim to it, that the state would then take the bond to restore the land, but that they could potentially, sell the scrap to also offset. So if you could get, I'm just going to make this number up, $1 million for the scrap, that if the bond was set for 10 million, that was the estimate, that you could potentially only pay for a $9 million bond, knowing that you would also be able to get the missing million by the scrap. And I think that sort of the analysis that was previously done was, maybe we'll only get $50,000 for the scrap. We don't know what's going to happen 25 years from now, how much steel is going to be worth. So, yeah, I think that's, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to have that conversation again with a fresh, perspective and a new group of folks. But do know that we have looked at this question before.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dugan.
Yeah, I want to know. It's like I don't think the state has gone through this process ever, necessarily of like, and my thought is there would be some sort of liquidation company that would come in and like deal. I don't imagine like state employees like, maybe like hiring contractors to pull piles out of the ground or pull down wind turbine towers. But maybe that is what would happen with the bond. I know that, when coming up with our own bonding amount, it was like, how much does it generally cost to remove a fence? And it's very, very simple things like that. I think the salvage value issue is exactly as you put it, and I don't want to disagree with the uncertainty. There's a lot of uncertainty what this will be. I think we know the number is above zero, but we don't exactly know what it is. And so, from an industry perspective, we're like, if it could offset some stuff, we would like to, because someone in the future will, in that, what I would call unlikely scenario, but could happen, right? There will be a value there. And, if there's a way that it could, help us with the burden on the front end of just holding, for our projects, it's $144 million bond, so it's a very large bond and the holding costs are quite high. And so if there's any way that we can try to get it as accurate as possible, that's kind of what we're going for. I don't have a ton on my head in terms of like what that exactly looks like. I will say, and maybe we can bring this into future conversation, is something I should look up, is, a lot of states in the South, I know Georgia and a few other states have put in laws around how much of the salvage value to consider when considering bonding. And so maybe we can look at some other states and what they found was reasonable. Not to say we'll copy them exactly, but it will add some context to how other people have considered this. Exactly.
I would be curious to know what like the most aggressive, generous state would allow, and then just for my own personal satisfaction, what does that mean? Like, if the most generous take on scrap value is that your cost would offset 1%, like, is that, I don't know. I kind of want to get a sense of like, how big of a benefit would this be? Is it worth the trouble of going through the calculations? Or is it such a small amount that it's not worth the effort? I don't know. I guess that'd be something I'd be interested in discovering. Councilmember Condon.
Yeah, thank you. Just another issue related here, and one that is very opaque to me, is there are agreements with landowners, with the property owners on these projects. And to the extent that those, our standard is that you retire the facility and remove the structures to have a usable condition of the property, of the land. Are there agreements with landowners that might say, well, we don't want the towers there for this wind project or the solar panels, but you can leave the shed and, some of the other structures? And do those ever, come into play? That is something we don't have a connection to. And would that enter into this discussion?
I think we have had this come up, and I'm trying to remember the context, where a developer was arguing that I need to look up the exact language, but whatever the requirement is, that you have to return the land to the whatever, prior state, that if the landowner was okay with certain things being left on the land, that met the requirement. And I think, I don't remember the context of that discussion. It wasn't a rulemaking, so I wasn't super paying attention, but we can maybe go back and look at that. I don't believe that the conclusion was that the council accepted that argument, but
And
it's not to
and
say
I
that's
think-
not something we can't look at here.
And I think it was a road, in that case, and it was kind
Yeah,
of a
yeah. That's,
quick discussion. But I mean, there might be certainly some reasonable,
like you don't have to rip up the road and return it to soil if the landowner was fine with that, just keeping the road
and
there.
council saw that agreement. I mean, there were proper evidence
Yeah.
given for that. I mean, it seems to me there are some other mitigating pieces of evidence that might
Reduce the bond value.
Yeah.
I got you.
Yeah. So.
Okay. David?
No, I think you got there in the end.
Okay.
I think though, in the end, that's such a small amount, and that would actually play into much more when if it ever got to that, the state would contract the decommissioning, and that would all would play out in that. I think be pretty small as far as a reduction in bonding. But that's just my perspective, but something to think about.
Yeah, and I do think, it's very important as part of this whole process is I do feel, there is always the twin obligation of like, public health and safety and risks to the state, but also like we want to be very sensitive to what we're asking from folks, and we want to make sure it's tied to reality, right? We don't want to have the regulations be so burdensome and unconnected to what actually occurs on the ground that we sort of inhibit production or development that would otherwise occur in the state. So I do think we try to be sensitive to that balance. So hopefully we can see that go forth as this rec chews on these issues. Any other thoughts or ideas about what I should throw on the schedule for as we get into the weeds on some of these issues? If nothing, there's no, I should probably come up with a deadline, but in the next couple of weeks, if something comes to mind, feel free to send it my way. And I suspect at this point, now that we've had these two discussions, that even though this is going to be one rulemaking, that the next rack will be just organizational expertise, and then the one after that might be just retirement financial assurance. So maybe at some future point when we sort of winnow these ideas down, we sort of recombine them to the extent we can kind of fit them all in a sub 2 hour time window. But I don't know, does that make sense to people, or people feel like that's a decent way to approach this? Like sort of pretend we're one rack, but split to two until we can go back to one again. I don't want to drag this process out, but I don't want to bite off more than we can chew, and in terms of getting into the weeds on some of these issues, I think will take some time. Go ahead, Councilmember Condon.
Thanks. I also don't want to lose sight, and I think it was brought up in the organizational expertise side of things, but Dugan's comment about the comfort letter and talking about that more in relation to this, to retirement and financial assurance and the value of it and what could take the place of that. What assures that? And Dugan made a comment about you can't do this until your bond is there. Would be good. And Tom, you might already be doing this, but any information we can get from other states, the developers probably know what is happening in all the other states, but any information about how other states are approaching these issues would be great. I'm just not steeped in it, and so it'd be good information to have for a foundation.
Yeah, and to the extent you're proposing as a given position, yeah, it is helpful to say, what we want is being done in these three, states or whatever. And I'm going to be looking at various places as well, but there's 49 other states. So you know, to the extent you have a vision about what you want things to look like, and it's in practice in other places, I mean, that's definitely helpful for us to review. Okay, well, I think I've got sort of a sense of where things are going to go from here. Not a very definitive one, but at least I've got an idea. Is there any members of the public that are on the rack? There's a couple present, but that are interested in adding their 2 cents. There will, of course, be future racks with future public comment opportunities, and then there'll be, once the draft language is developed and approved for notice of proposed rulemaking, there'll be a formal public comment period where everyone, including the RAC members, can raise any issues or concerns. Okay, well, this is for those of you who are in last Thursday's RAC meeting. I'm just going to remind you all again, if you have any ideas or concerns, I didn't even change the slides. It says compliance rules. The organizational expertise from retirement financial assurance rules. Please send that to me. And yeah, I mean, I got everything that everyone said at this meeting today, but there's something you wanted to emphasize, or maybe you had additional information to flesh out your thought or concern. The more you can give me, the more I have to work with. Otherwise, you're stuck with whatever I come up with in terms of what we're going to focus on. Okay. I guess that's that. We finished 11 minutes early. Good job, everybody. If you have any questions or anything, there's my email address there. It's also on the website if you forget to write this down. And actually, this slide will also be on the website. I fixed your name, Jordan. So you can review that there along with the video of this whole RAC meeting. We one of the recent changes we've done with the rulemaking page in the last couple of months is we had sort of a big long blog with just every single rulemaking just on one basic web page. It was sort of confusing. We now have links when you go to the rulemaking page, and you click the link for this organizational expertise rulemaking, and it will just be this rulemaking with the schedule, and any RAC recordings, any agendas or PowerPoint presentations will all just be right there. So hopefully that's way easier for people to use than what we had before, which, well, I mean, we used to not have very many rulemakings, so I guess it made sense at one point, but these days, that wasn't really working out for us. So hopefully what we've put together helps out on that front a little bit better. With that, I would say thank you all, and I will look out for a poll for me for when we're going to have our next REC meeting. Thank you all.
Cheers all. Happy holidays.
Yeah, same to you.
Happy holidays. Thanks much.
Happy holidays. See y'all.